Hey, it's Riffy coming to you from the floor of my living room. So what we're going to talk about here in the second section of notes that we have for the nervous system, the first thing we're really going to get into are reflex arcs and positive and negative feedback loops. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So, your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system work together. This should seem fairly obvious to you for when people actually become paralyzed. You will notice that they still can do certain functions and they are conscious and aware, but they lack the ability to control some appendages like their arms or their legs or things like that. So, they are a collaborative group that work together. Um, so when we study reaction to a stimulus, what it does is it shows us how the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system interact. So when we watch a stimulus be absorbed by the body and what reaction occurs, we can understand how the two work together. So a reflex and a feedback loop aren't necessarily the same thing, but a reflex tends to be some kind of automatic motor response to a specific stimulus. You can think of these kind of like instinctual reactions that occur in the body that you really don't notice you do or that you don't even think about. But if someone were to throw something at you from, your peripheral vision, you kind of duck, or you blink to a loud noise, or um, when you step on something sharp and you remove your foot, or you touch something hot and you remove your hand. All of these are reflexes. These are things that you automatically do in response to some kind of specific stimuli. So the first thing we're going to get into are what are called simple reflexes, and a simple reflex can be best understood if you talk about a reflex arc. Reflex arc is the wiring of a single reflex that shows the pathway from stimulus to response. I have a quick YouTube video I do want to show you that I think kind of uh, helps you see.
Reflex action and reflex arc. Whenever we happen to come close to an object that is capable of harming us, we immediately withdraw the part of the body that is the most vulnerable. This is called reflex action. When a person touches a hot cup, the sensory receptors in the hand send a stimulus via the afferent pathway, which contains afferent neurons, to the spinal cord. The afferent neurons enter the dorsal nerve root of the spinal cord. The stimulus is passed on to the efferent neuron, which travels the efferent pathway to reach the effector organ, in this case the muscles of the arm. As a result, the hand is quickly pulled back. The brain is not involved in the reflex actions, as it would take more time for the impulses to travel to and fro from the brain. The afferent neurons, or receptors, taking the causal stimulus to the CNS, the spinal cord. The efferent neurons, or effectors, the exciter neurons, and the action performed in response to the stimulus together form the reflex arc.
So what you notice there is very quickly and very effectively, he showed how grabbing something hot generates an action potential or signal which travels through specific pathways in the body, reaching the central nervous system, but it doesn't actually have to be wired completely to the brain because you don't have to bring this to conscious awareness. And then that stimulus gets sent back out through the peripheral nervous system yet again, so you can exhibit a response to the stimuli. So there is an exact pattern that occurs for reflex arcs, and I have a generalized form, and then I'll get a little bit more specific here in a little bit, but the basic thing is some kind of stimulus or environmental change has occurred which activates some kind of receptor. In our next unit and in part of this actual unit, we're going to talk about specific types of receptors. For example, like pain receptors are called nociceptors, and pressure receptors are called baroreceptors. We've already talked a little bit about proprioceptors and things like that, but we're going to get more into those in a little bit. But regardless of the fact that there's some kind of stimulus which activates a receptor, that activated receptor sends a signal, which is called an action potential, down a sensory neuron. This is also part of the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. Once it travels throughout that afferent division of the peripheral nervous system, it's headed directly to the central nervous system, keeping in mind that the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. But in a simple reflex arc, we don't actually have to involve the brain. It can just simply travel to the central nervous system portion, just the spinal cord. Once it reaches that spinal cord, you can, in air quotes, kind of talk about it processing the information. The decision is made as to what is going to happen. What that then happens is through the activation of a sensory neuron and it's synapsing with the central nervous system. New signal is generated that travels down a motor neuron, which is part of the efferent division of the central nervous system, on its way to an effector for a response to be exhibited. You can tie kind of reflexes with positive and negative feedback loops, but a lot of positive and negative feedback loops tend to involve the brain, but they are kind of coincide together. If we go back to some of the examples we had earlier, when you eat something, it causes your blood sugar to rise. That blood sugar rising is the actual stimulus, which is detected by the pancreas itself. That pancreas then secretes glucose in response to high sugar levels, and that glucose is used by cells to remove high. I apologize. Let's go back a step. When you eat something, it causes your blood sugar to rise, which is detected by your pancreas. Your pancreas then secretes insulin, not glucose, in response to the high glucose levels, telling things like your liver and your cells to take in some of that glucose, which then drops your blood sugar levels, bringing it back to normal levels. So again, you have the same concept of the reflex arc, but this is an example of a negative feedback loop. We've gone over this positive feedback loop several times before with childbirth and how we're trying to enhance the stimulus, whereas here we're trying to remove the stimulus. So the stimulus here is the high blood sugar levels that we're trying to remove, and here the stimulus is the head pushing against the cervix. Well, we want that to continually occur and occur and occur until baby leaves. That's a positive feedback loop, and all the actions that occur within this positive feedback loop are done in order to enhance the pushing of the head against the cervix until baby is born. A lot of your reflexes are what are called monosynaptic, mono the prefix meaning one. They really only have a sensory neuron that synapses directly to a motor neuron. These are extremely fast. For example, that knee-jerk reaction that the doctor always tests your reflexes for at the doctor's office is going to be an example of a monosynaptic reflex. Complex reflexes or polysynaptic reflexes are those that involve at least one interneuron between sensory neurons and motor neurons, and they also tend to occur more than one structure involved in the actual response themselves. So like when you grab something hot, you have to have that withdrawal reflex, but what you remember about muscles is muscles work in pairs. They work in antagonistic pairs. So you have the one that does the flexing while the other does the relaxing. Well, when you grab something hot, you have to switch and maneuver those muscles, some to relax and some to contract. That involves multiple synapses with multiple structures in order to exhibit the response. So, since there are more nerves involved, it usually isn't as fast as a simple reflex. For example, when the doctor hits you with the knee, that happens really quick. When you grab something hot and you have to move away from it or you step on something sharp, the time frame, even though really fast, is slightly longer than that knee-jerk reflex. So, looking at this picture again, here's a basic wiring of a reflex arc. You have your stimulus, you have your receptor. In this particular one right here, the receptor are the dendrites of a specific neuron. Then what happens when you activate the receptor from that stimulus, it actually causes the signal to travel down the sensory neuron. Here they call it the visceral sensory fiber. Remember, like nerve fibers are the same thing as neurons. Travels throughout until it reaches the dorsal root, which then embeds itself into the spinal cord and travels into the gray matter itself of the spinal cord, where it synapses with the motor neuron, and the motor neuron travels out to the effector, which then in fact exhibits the response. This would be a monosynaptic or simple reflex arc, keeping in mind that this sensory neuron synapses directly with the interneuron. Here in this example, however, which is a little bit more difficult to see, you will notice that because of the fact that the response involves multiple muscles, for example, one contracting, one relaxing, in the central nervous system, that sensory neuron synapses with multiple interneurons. That's what the green and the pink represent here. Remember, interneurons are only found in the central nervous system, which helps direct or generate action potentials through multiple motor neurons, telling one to contract while the other relaxes in order to exhibit the response. So let's recap real quick, and this is a lot more specific example, is the fact that what you need to understand about reflex arcs and feedback loops is the fact that it always starts with a stimulus or some kind of environmental change that is going to be picked up by the receptor. That receptor then generates an action potential, and we're going to get into action potential here in a little bit, but it's a fancy word for the electrical signal that travels down neurons. So the receptor generates an action potential which travels through the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system through a sensory neuron, which can also be called an afferent neuron, and its direction is headed to the central nervous system. Keep in mind, once it reaches that central nervous system, it synapses with the central nervous system if it is a complex or polysynaptic reflex arc. When it reaches the central nervous system in a monosynaptic, it synapses directly with the motor neuron. But I want to talk more so about polysynaptic. So going back to step 3, a sensory neuron synapses in the central nervous system. Interneurons are those that are located just in the central nervous system, synapse with that sensory neuron, and this signal is then processed or integrated, and it generates a motor signal. That interneuron then synapses in the central nervous system with a motor neuron, which carries the signal out of the central nervous system and through the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. The action potential that's generated travels down the motor neuron, and its location is to an effector. And then to remember, keep in mind, the multiple motor neurons can carry the motor signal or the effector signal to multiple effectors. And once it reaches that effector, the motor neuron synapses yet again with whatever structure is going to exhibit the response. This is the more detailed version of what we went over before, and it carries all those buzzwords in there. So just to see what kind of skill you have, I'm going to put up this reflex arc here, which involves, for some sick reason, somebody stabbing themselves with a pin or a needle in the finger. So if we take a look at this, what I'm kind of want you to do is pause this video, take a look at this diagram, and I want you to try to take every single one of these terms and place them in some kind of location, or think about where they would be placed within this diagram. Keep in mind there's a couple that could technically be used more than once. So go ahead and pause the video, get yourself some practice in here, try to decide if this is a monosynaptic or a polysynaptic, and is it simple or a complex reflex arc. And then what's going to happen here in a second is you're probably going to want to pause it right now. Get that practice done, because the answers are going to start flying up on the screen here in a second. Okay, since you paused it, I guarantee you probably got it right. So let's go through the answers. Any reflex arc always starts with some kind of environmental change, which is a stimulus. In this example here, you have in fact some sick individual stabbing themselves with a needle. Well, that stab is picked up by a receptor, so the stimulus activates a receptor here. They're the dendrites of this sensory neuron here, which generates an action potential that travels down the sensory neuron, which is this bad boy right here, or afferent division of the peripheral nervous system, until that signal travels and travels and travels and enters in through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root, passing through the dorsal root ganglion, until it in fact reaches and synapses with the central nervous system and an interneuron of the central nervous system, which would be this bad boy right here. Well, once that signal is integrated and processed, it generates a motor signal, which then that interneuron synapses yet again with a motor neuron, which is part of the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, and that signal travels down through the ventral root, through and out the spinal nerve, traveling on its low way to the effector itself, which it synapses yet again with an effector, communicating that response to, in this example, the skeletal muscles of the finger, causing it to exhibit a response which is the contraction of the muscles and the removal of the finger from the stimulus. That's the end of part 2A. You know what to do if you have any questions. See you in class.